My name is Ruby, and I'm 58 years old. I've been a mother for over half my life, and I thought I knew what sacrifice meant until my daughter Sarah turned 28 and showed me just how wrong I could be. Standing in my small kitchen that Tuesday morning, wrapping the birthday gift I'd spent 3 weeks making by hand, I felt that familiar flutter of hope in my chest. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this birthday party would bring my daughter and me closer together again, the way we used to be before she married James and his mother Helena came into our lives. I thought this birthday would bring us closer, but I had no idea how wrong I was. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt overlooked by someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe because you'll want to see how this unfolds. Trust me, what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Let me take you back 6 years to when my world first started shifting. My husband Frank passed away from cancer, leaving me to navigate life as a widow at 52. Frank and I had built something beautiful together, raising Sarah in a modest but love-filled home where every Sunday meant pancakes shaped like hearts, and every scraped knee got kissed better by both of us. After Frank died, Sarah became my anchor. We'd spend hours talking over coffee shopping for bargains at Target and baking cookies while sharing stories about our days. She was my best friend, my confidant, the light that kept me going through those dark months of grief. But everything changed when James Patterson entered the picture 2 years ago. Don't get me wrong, James is a decent man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He treats Sarah well, opens doors for her, and remembers to bring flowers on special occasions. The problem isn't James himself. The problem is his mother, Helena Patterson, a woman who wears her wealth like armor and her opinions like weapons. Helena lives in a sprawling estate in the affluent part of town, complete with manicured gardens and a 3-car garage. She drives a silver Mercedes and never leaves the house without her pearl earrings and that condescending smile that makes my skin crawl. From the moment James brought Sarah home to meet his family, Helena made it crystal clear that she found me lacking. She'd look around my small apartment with barely concealed disdain, commenting on how cozy everything was, in a tone that made cozy sound like a disease. The wedding was my first real taste of Helena's power. While I scraped together every penny to buy Sarah a modest dress from a department store, Helena whisked her away for a shopping spree at exclusive boutiques. My daughter came home with bags full of designer shoes and accessories, talking about how generous Helena was, how sophisticated her taste was. Each compliment felt like a tiny knife cutting away at the bond Sarah and I had built over 26 years. After the wedding, the distance between Sarah and me grew wider with each passing month. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. When Sarah did come by, she'd spend most of the time on her phone texting Helena about dinner plans or shopping trips. I'd catch glimpses of their conversations, seeing how Helena had inserted herself into every aspect of my daughter's life. She had opinions about Sarah's career, her wardrobe, even her choice of breakfast cereal. Meanwhile, I was working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water. My morning shift at the local diner started at 6 a.m., serving coffee and eggs to construction workers and early commuters. My evening job cleaning offices downtown lasted until 10 p.m., mopping floors and emptying trash cans in buildings where people like Helena conducted their important business. I came home exhausted every night, my hands rough from work, my feet aching, wondering where I'd gone wrong as a mother. The worst part was watching James struggle with his own mother's interference. I could see it in his eyes during family gatherings, the way he'd open his mouth to speak and then close it when Helena shot him one of her warning looks. He loved Sarah deeply, but he'd been trained from birth to defer to his mother's judgment. Helena had raised him to believe that her approval was more valuable than his own instincts, and now Sarah was falling into that same trap. 3 weeks before Sarah's 28th birthday, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of buying something from a store I couldn't afford, I decided to create something with my own hands. I spent hours watching YouTube tutorials about jewelry making, learning how to shape wire and attach charms. The project consumed my evenings after my cleaning job, my fingers working by lamplight in my quiet apartment. The centerpiece of my gift was a silver bracelet with a small heart-shaped charm. But this wasn't just any charm. Years ago, when Sarah turned 16, I'd given her a similar bracelet with a heart that had her name engraved on one side and her birth date on the other. She wore it every day until it broke during her senior year of college, and she'd been heartbroken when we couldn't find the pieces. I'd never forgotten the disappointment in her eyes that day. Now, using the small inheritance Frank had left me, I bought the tools and materials to recreate that lost treasure. I spent my lunch breaks at the diner researching the exact font I'd used for the original engraving. I called 3 different jewelry shops to find the right shade of silver. Every detail had to be perfect because this wasn't just a birthday gift. This was my attempt to remind Sarah of who we used to be together before Helena's influence started pulling her away. The process wasn't easy. My hands, calloused from years of manual labor, weren't steady enough for delicate work at first. I pricked my fingers countless times with the tiny tools. I made 4 practice charms before I created one good enough for my daughter. Each night, I'd unwrap my progress from its tissue paper and hold it up to the light, imagining Sarah's face when she realized what it was. But the bracelet was only part of my preparation. I also bought a new dress for the party, a simple navy blue number from the clearance rack at Macy's. It wasn't designer like the clothes Helena favored, but it was clean and pressed and made me feel presentable. I made an appointment at the budget salon near my apartment, asking the stylist to trim my grey-streaked hair into something youthful and neat. I even practiced what I'd say when I gave Sarah the gift. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I rehearsed different versions of the story about the original bracelet, trying to find the words that would help her remember the mother-daughter bond we'd once shared. I wanted to sound confident and loving, not desperate or needy, like Helena always made me feel. The night before the party, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my stomach churning with anxiety. Part of me worried that Helena would find some way to diminish my gift, to make it seem cheap or inadequate, compared to whatever expensive present she'd chosen. But a bigger part of me hoped that this handmade token of love would cut through all the materialism and manipulation, reminding Sarah of the woman who'd raised her with nothing but devotion and sacrifice. The birthday party was held at James and Sarah's house, a beautiful 2-story colonial that Helena had helped them buy. As I pulled into the driveway in my 15-year-old Honda, I could see through the large windows that the living room was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements and silver balloons. A catering truck was parked around back, and I could smell the aroma of expensive food drifting through the evening air. I clutched my small gift bag and took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. Sarah answered wearing a stunning black cocktail dress I'd never seen before. Her hair professionally styled in loose curls. She looked radiant and sophisticated, every inch the successful young woman I'd raised her to be. But when she saw me, her smile became polite rather than warm, the kind of expression you'd give to a distant acquaintance. The living room was filled with couples I didn't recognize, all dressed in expensive clothes and speaking in the refined tones of Helena's social circle. I felt immediately out of place in my clearance dress and discount shoes. James greeted me kindly, offering to take my coat and asking if I wanted something to drink, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew tonight would be complicated. Helena made her entrance 20 minutes later, sweeping into the room like royalty arriving at court. She wore an elegant cream-coloured suit with genuine pearl jewellery, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon. In her hands was a large Tiffany blue box tied with white ribbon, the kind of packaging that screams expensive even from across a crowded room. The gift opening ceremony became the centerpiece of the evening. Sarah sat in the middle of the living room while everyone gathered around to watch. Helena presented her box with great fanfare, explaining to the assembled guests how she'd special ordered this particular piece because Sarah had admired it during their last shopping trip together. When Sarah opened the box, gasps echoed through the room. Inside was a stunning diamond necklace with a pendant shaped like a flower, each petal outlined in white gold and centered with a brilliant cut stone. The necklace caught the light from every angle, sparkling like captured stars. Sarah's face lit up with genuine joy as she lifted it from its velvet nest. Helena moved behind Sarah to fasten the clasp, and I watched as my daughter transformed before my eyes. The necklace elevated her entire appearance, making her look like the kind of woman who belonged in magazine pages or charity galas. Helena stepped back with obvious satisfaction, accepting praise from the other guests about her impeccable taste and generous heart. Sarah threw her arms around Helena, calling her the most thoughtful person she knew. She kept touching the necklace, adjusting it so the pendant caught the light just right. Several guests took photos of the two of them together, Helena beaming like a proud mother, while Sarah glowed with happiness. The display of affection between them was genuine and warm, everything I'd hoped my own gift-giving moment would be. When it was finally my turn, the room fell silent in a different way. I approached Sarah with my small gift bag, suddenly aware of how inadequate it looked compared to the Tiffany box that now sat empty on the coffee table. My hands trembled slightly as I handed it over, and I could feel Helena's eyes boring into me from across the room. Sarah opened the bag and pulled out the jewelry box I'd wrapped in tissue paper. When she opened it to reveal the handmade bracelet, I began to explain its significance, my voice growing stronger as I told the story of the original charm she'd loved and lost. But before I could finish, Sarah looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, dismissive, almost cruel. That's when she said the words that shattered my world. Mum Helena deserves this beautiful necklace because she's always been there for me. You don't deserve a gift like this. The silence that followed Sarah's words was deafening. I felt as though someone had slapped me across the face in front of a room full of strangers. The handmade bracelet suddenly looked pathetic in its simple box, an amateur's attempt at creating something meaningful. Helena's smile never wavered, but I caught the flash of triumph in her eyes. She had won, and she wanted me to know it. James looked mortified, his face flushing red as he glanced between his wife and me. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding their wine glasses fascinating, but most of them simply watched, waiting to see how this family drama would unfold. I realized that some of them probably agreed with Sarah's assessment. After all, what did I have to offer compared to Helena's obvious wealth and sophistication? Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to point out the years I'd sacrificed for Sarah's happiness, the countless nights I'd worked extra shifts to pay for her school clothes and extracurricular activities. I wanted to remind her of the bedtime stories, the scraped knees I'd kissed the homework sessions at our kitchen table. But something stopped me. Maybe it was dignity, maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the sudden clarity that came with seeing my daughter's true feelings so starkly displayed. Instead of creating a scene, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I smiled, not a happy smile, but the kind of expression a person wears when they've just learned something important about the world. I reached over and gently closed the jewelry box containing my handmade bracelet, slipping it back into the gift bag with careful movements. "Of course she does," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "The necklace is absolutely beautiful on you, sweetheart. Helena has wonderful taste." Helena's eyebrows rose slightly, as if she'd expected more of a fight. Sarah looked almost disappointed by my gracious response, like she'd been preparing for a confrontation that never came. I could see her touching the diamond necklace again, perhaps reassuring herself that she'd made the right choice in rejecting my gift so publicly. I stayed for another hour making polite conversation with the other guests and complimenting the catering. I watched as Sarah showed off her new necklace to everyone who would listen, explaining how Helena had chosen it specially for her. I observed Helena holding court near the fireplace, accepting praise for her generosity, while occasionally glancing my way with barely concealed satisfaction. But most importantly, I began to really see what was happening in my daughter's life. This wasn't just about one birthday party or one expensive gift. This was about a systematic campaign to replace me in Sarah's affections. Helena hadn't just bought my daughter a necklace. She'd bought my daughter's loyalty, her gratitude, her love. And Sarah, perhaps without even realizing it, had decided that love could indeed be purchased. When I finally left that night, I kissed Sarah goodbye and thanked her for including me in her celebration. I shook Helena's hand and complimented her on the lovely party. I hugged James and told him how happy I was to see him and Sarah doing so well. But inside I was already planning my next move, because if there's one thing I learned from 30 years of marriage and 28 years of motherhood, it's that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is patience. The weeks that followed Sarah's birthday party were a revelation. Instead of wallowing in hurt feelings or confronting my daughter directly, I decided to become a student of manipulation. I wanted to understand exactly how Helena had managed to turn my own child against me so completely. What I discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. My investigation began on social media, where Sarah posted photos of herself wearing the diamond necklace almost daily. She tagged Helena in every picture, adding captions like, "Feeling blessed by my second mother," and "so grateful for the wisdom and generosity in my life." Each post received dozens of likes and comments from Helena's social circle, reinforcing the message that expensive gifts equaled genuine love. I created a fake Facebook account and requested to join a private group where Helena and her friends shared recommendations for restaurants, charities, and social events. What I found there made my stomach turn. Helena had been systematically bad-mouthing me for months, sharing carefully edited stories about my financial struggles and what she called my inappropriate attachment to Sarah. She painted me as a needy, clingy mother who couldn't accept that her daughter had outgrown her humble beginnings. But the real shock came when I started following the paper trail of Helena's generosity. Through careful observation and a few strategic conversations with James during his lunch breaks at the office where I cleaned, I discovered that Helena had been financially supporting Sarah in ways I never imagined. She'd paid off Sarah's student loans the month before the wedding. She'd covered the down payment on their house. She was currently funding Sarah's MBA program at a prestigious private university. The manipulation was brilliant in its subtlety. Helena never demanded gratitude or recognition for these gifts. Instead, she positioned herself as a loving mother figure who simply wanted the best for her new daughter. But each act of generosity came with invisible strings attached, creating a web of obligation and debt that made it almost impossible for Sarah to criticize or distance herself from her benefactor. I also learned that Helena had a history of this behavior. Through my fake social media account, I connected with women who'd known Helena's family for decades. They whispered about her first daughter-in-law, a sweet girl named Jessica, who'd been slowly frozen out of the family after refusing to distance herself from her own parents. Jessica's marriage to Helena's older son had ended in divorce after 3 years of constant interference and manipulation. The most chilling discovery was a conversation I overheard between Helena and one of her friends at the grocery store. They were discussing Sarah's pregnancy plans, and Helena mentioned how she was looking forward to being the primary grandparent because some people simply don't have the resources or refinement to properly influence the next generation. She was already planning to marginalize me in my future grandchildren's lives. Armed with this knowledge, I began to formulate a plan that would expose Helena's true nature without making me look like a jealous, vindictive mother. I needed Sarah to see the manipulation for herself, to understand that genuine love couldn't be bought or sold. But most importantly, I needed to do it in a way that would force Helena to reveal her true character in front of witnesses she cared about impressing. The opportunity came when Sarah mentioned that she and James would be hosting Thanksgiving dinner for both families. Helena had volunteered to handle the catering naturally and had invited several of her closest friends to join the celebration. It would be the perfect stage for my carefully orchestrated revelation. Thanksgiving morning arrived grey and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what I knew would be the most important performance of my life. I'd spent weeks gathering evidence, making phone calls, and arranging what I privately called my moment of truth. Everything had to be perfect, because I would only get one chance to expose Helena's manipulation before she found a way to discredit me permanently. I arrived at Sarah and James's house carrying a simple pumpkin pie I'd made from scratch, knowing that Helena's catered feast would make my humble contribution look insignificant. But that was intentional. I wanted to appear exactly as Helena had always portrayed me, the struggling single mother with good intentions but limited resources. It would make my eventual revelation all the more powerful. Helena was already there, directing the catering staff and rearranging Sarah's dining room to better accommodate her elaborate place settings. She wore an elegant burgundy dress and her signature pearl jewellery, looking every inch the gracious hostess, despite being a guest in someone else's home. When she saw me, she offered one of her practiced smiles and complimented my pie with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for a child's finger painting. Sarah looked radiant in a new designer dress that I suspected Helena had purchased for the occasion. The diamond necklace caught the afternoon light streaming through the dining room windows, and she kept touching it unconsciously throughout the day. James seemed relaxed for once, probably relieved that both his mother and mother-in-law appeared to be getting along so well. The other guests arrived throughout the afternoon: Helena's bridge club friends, a couple from their country club, and the pastor from their Episcopal church. All pillars of their exclusive community, all people whose opinions Helena valued deeply. They were exactly the audience I needed for what was about to unfold. As we sat down for dinner, Helena positioned herself at the head of the table, despite being in someone else's home. She led the blessing with practiced eloquence, thanking God for bringing such wonderful people together, and for the opportunity to share in Sarah's continued growth and success. Several guests murmured their agreement, and I saw Sarah beam with pride at being the centre of so much positive attention. The conversation during dinner was carefully controlled by Helena, who steered discussions toward topics that allowed her to showcase her sophistication and generosity. She mentioned the charity boards she served on, the cultural events she sponsored, and the mentorship she was providing to young women from modest backgrounds who needed guidance in navigating society's complexities. Every comment was a subtle reminder of her superiority and my inadequacy, but I waited patiently through it all, making appropriate responses and playing the part of the grateful poor relation. I complimented Helena's excellent taste in wines and asked thoughtful questions about her charitable work. To any observer, I appeared completely comfortable with my secondary role in Sarah's life. Helena began to relax, perhaps thinking that I'd finally accepted my diminished status. That's when I made my move. During a lull in conversation, I cleared my throat gently and addressed the table with a warm smile. Before we have dessert, I'd like to share something special with everyone here. Helena, you've been such a wonderful influence on Sarah, and I think it would mean a lot to her to hear about your experience with family relationships, particularly your wisdom about helping young couples navigate the early years of marriage. Helena preened at the compliment, clearly pleased to be recognized for her expertise in front of her social circle. Well, Ruby, that's very sweet of you to say. I do pride myself on understanding what it takes to build strong family bonds. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, I replied, pulling out my phone with steady hands, because I've invited someone special to join us who can speak to your incredible gift for bringing families together. The confusion that rippled around the table was palpable as I pressed the FaceTime button on my phone. Helena's expression shifted from pleased satisfaction to puzzled concern while Sarah leaned forward with obvious curiosity. James looked between his mother and me with growing alarm as if sensing that something momentous was about to happen. The call connected and Jessica Martinez appeared on my screen. She was Helena's former daughter-in-law, the sweet young woman who'd been married to Helena's older son David for 3 turbulent years before their divorce. I'd tracked her down through social media and spent hours on the phone with her listening to a story that was heartbreakingly familiar. "Hello, everyone," Jessica said through the phone's speaker, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent dining room. "Mrs. Patterson, it's been a long time. You look exactly the same." Helena's face had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her pale skin. She gripped her wine glass so tightly that her knuckles showed white, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to understand how this ghost from her past had materialized at her perfectly orchestrated family dinner. "Jessica has agreed to share her experience as your daughter-in-law," I continued, my voice remaining steady despite my racing heart. "Sarah, I thought you might be interested to hear about the mentorship and guidance Helena provided to another young woman who married into the Patterson family." Sarah's confusion was evident as she looked from the phone to Helena and back again. "I didn't know James had a brother who'd been married before," she said slowly. "Oh, yes," Jessica replied, her voice gaining strength. "David and I were together for 3 years, and Mrs. Patterson was incredibly involved in our relationship from the very beginning, just like she's been with you, Sarah. In fact, the similarities are remarkable." What followed was 20 minutes of revelation that shattered the comfortable narrative Helena had constructed about herself. Jessica described how Helena had initially showered her with gifts and attention, making her feel special and chosen. She explained how those gifts came with expectations and obligations that slowly isolated her from her own family and friends. Jessica told the stunned dinner guests about the student loans Helena had paid off the car she'd bought the apartment deposit she'd covered. She described how Helena had gradually convinced David that Jessica's middle-class family was holding them back socially and professionally. She shared the devastating moment when Helena had orchestrated a confrontation that ended with David choosing his mother's version of success over his wife's happiness. "The worst part," Jessica continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words, "wasn't the divorce itself. It was realizing that I'd been slowly losing myself for 3 years, trying to become the person Mrs. Patterson wanted me to be, instead of appreciating who I actually was." Helena finally found her voice, though it came out as a harsh whisper. "This is completely inappropriate, Ruby. How dare you ambush my guests with this nonsense?" But I wasn't finished. From my purse, I pulled out printed copies of text messages, bank statements, and social media posts that I'd been collecting for months. Evidence of Helena's financial manipulation, her strategic gift-giving, and most damning of all, screenshots of her private social media posts where she'd discussed her plans to properly guide Sarah away from her mother's unfortunate influences. "I thought everyone should see what genuine family devotion looks like," I said, distributing the papers around the table. "These documents show the pattern of Helena's involvement in Sarah's life, the debt payments, the strategic gifts, the systematic campaign to replace me in my daughter's affections." James was staring at the bank statements with growing horror, recognizing amounts and dates that Helena had never mentioned to him. Sarah picked up the social media screenshots with trembling hands, reading her mother-in-law's private thoughts about her own mother. The other dinner guests, sat in stunned silence, their elegant Thanksgiving dinner transformed into a courtroom where uncomfortable truths were being revealed. Helena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is outrageous," she declared, her voice shaking with rage. "I've done nothing but try to help this family succeed. If Ruby chooses to interpret generosity as manipulation, that says more about her character than mine. Then explain this," I said quietly, pulling out the final piece of evidence I'd been saving. It was a recording I'd made of Helena's conversation at the grocery store, where she'd discussed her plans to marginalize me in my future grandchildren's lives. Her own voice filled the dining room, speaking words that no loving grandmother would ever say about a child's parent. The sound of Helena's recorded voice planning my exclusion from family life was the final straw that broke Sarah's composure. She stood up slowly, the diamond necklace catching the light one last time before she reached behind her neck and unclasped it. The expensive jewellery fell onto her plate with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the silent room. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner unfolded over the following weeks like a slow-motion earthquake. Helena left the house that evening in a fury of righteous indignation, declaring that she'd been betrayed and slandered by people who didn't appreciate her sacrifices. She took her catered leftovers, her expensive wine, and her injured pride, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. But her departure left behind a vacuum that Sarah and James had to fill for themselves. Without Helena's financial safety net, they were forced to confront the reality of their actual circumstances. The house they'd thought they could afford was actually beyond their means. Sarah's MBA program would require student loans that they'd have to repay themselves. The lifestyle they'd been living was built on Helena's generosity, not their own success. The first few days were difficult for everyone. Sarah barely spoke to me, processing the revelation that her beloved second mother had been manipulating her for years. James struggled with anger toward his own mother and guilt about his role in enabling her behaviour. I gave them space to work through their emotions, knowing that healing would take time and couldn't be rushed. But gradually, Sarah began to reach out. It started with a simple text message. "Can we talk?" We met for coffee at a small cafe near her office, sitting across from each other like strangers, trying to rebuild a relationship from scratch. She apologized for her cruelty at the birthday party, tears streaming down her face as she acknowledged how deeply she'd hurt me. I listened without judgment, understanding that she'd been as much a victim of Helena's manipulation as I had been. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to rediscover parts of herself that had been suppressed during her relationship with Helena. She started wearing clothes that reflected her own taste rather than Helena's sophisticated preferences. She called me more frequently, asking for advice about work problems and sharing funny stories about her day. Most significantly, she asked me to help her return to the simple pleasures we'd once shared together. We started baking together again on Sunday afternoons, making the same chocolate chip cookies we'd perfected when she was in middle school. We went shopping for bargains at discount stores, laughing about our finds and remembering the joy of discovering treasures in unexpected places. Sarah even asked me to teach her some of the practical skills I'd learned during my years of financial struggle, wanting to understand how to build a life based on genuine values rather than purchase status. The handmade bracelet that she'd rejected at her birthday party found its way back into her jewellery box. One evening, I noticed her wearing it to dinner, the simple silver charm catching the light from our kitchen fixture. She'd chosen it over the diamond necklace that still sat untouched in her bedroom drawer, an expensive reminder of the relationship she'd outgrown. James, meanwhile, began the difficult process of establishing boundaries with his mother. He wrote her a letter, explaining that while he loved her, he couldn't accept her interference in his marriage. He returned the keys to the house she'd helped them buy, insisting that they would find a place they could afford on their own. Most importantly, he supported Sarah's decision to rebuild her relationship with me, understanding that genuine family bonds couldn't be purchased or manipulated. Helena made several attempts to restore her influence, offering to forgive our Thanksgiving misunderstanding if we agreed to forget the entire incident. She sent expensive gifts with notes about family loyalty and second chances. She even approached James at his office, pleading with him to remember everything she'd done for his happiness. But her efforts fell on deaf ears. Sarah and James had learned to recognize manipulation disguised as love, and they refused to be drawn back into Helena's web. The healing process wasn't always smooth. There were moments when Sarah struggled with doubts, wondering if she'd made the right choice in rejecting Helena's support. There were times when I questioned whether exposing the truth had been worth the pain it caused my daughter. But gradually, we rebuilt something stronger than what we'd had before, a relationship based on honesty, respect, and unconditional love. As Christmas approached, Sarah asked if we could start new traditions together, ones that didn't involve expensive gifts or elaborate displays. We decided to volunteer at a local food bank, serving holiday meals to families who reminded me of myself during my struggling years. Working side by side, ladling gravy and arranging dinner rolls, I saw my daughter truly happy for the first time in years. She was learning that the greatest gift we can give each other isn't found in any store or jewelry box. One evening, as we sat in my small apartment, sharing takeout Chinese food and planning our volunteer schedule, Sarah looked at me with clear eyes and said something that made all the pain worthwhile. "Mum, I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that love isn't something you can buy. It's something you build day by day with the people who matter most." She was wearing the handmade bracelet, and the simple charm caught the light from my discount lamp, shining brighter than any diamond ever could. Looking back on that transformative year, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to expose the lies they're living, even when it causes temporary pain. Helena had offered my daughter a gilded cage disguised as freedom wealth, disguised as love, and status disguised as worth. But true family relationships can't be purchased with expensive gifts or maintained through financial manipulation. They're built through shared struggles, honest communication, and the willingness to love someone even when they can't love you back. Sarah and I are closer now than we've ever been, not because I competed with Helena's generosity, but because I helped my daughter remember who she really was underneath all those expensive gifts. And every time I see her touch that simple silver charm on her wrist, I'm reminded that the most precious things in life are the ones we create with our own hands and give with our whole hearts. Sometimes staying quiet isn't about weakness or submission. Sometimes it's about gathering the strength and wisdom necessary to speak the truth when it matters most. And sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is patient love that refuses to be bought, sold, or silenced. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and standing up for what's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear that genuine love can't be purchased. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about real families navigating life's challenges with grace and courage. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that the most valuable gifts we give each other can't be found in any store. May your own family relationships be built on truth, respect, and unconditional love.